In Eugene Peterson's book on the life of David entitled Leap Over a Wall, he mentions that when most of us come into this world, we are immediately loved. We are cared for, coddled, and cuddled. And I might add to that before we even come into the world, a lot of people are anxiously expecting our arrival. They love us before we even get here, and then they have a baby shower and everybody wants to pass the baby around. Everyone wants their turn cuddling the baby because everybody loves the baby. And that is sadly not the case for all children, but it is the case for most upper middle class Americans at least. We are loved before anyone ever even sees us, but we're also in for a rude awakening. For in time we experience the shock that not everyone is going to love us just the way we are. Peterson suspects that not long after the first diaper change, some are going to start thinking of us as intruders, trespassers, or rivals. We are criticized. We come to the playground or the nursery or as early as kindergarten even, maybe not just after the first diaper change, but eventually we face the reality that not everyone has the opinion of us, the good opinion of us that God does. Not everyone shares that excellent attitude of us. And Peterson continued that enmity was one of the powerful shaping influences in the life of Jesus. In fact, one of the most powerfully shaping influences. And that's true of us too, because we all live with enmity in our lives as well. We are criticized, teased, avoided, attacked, shot at, abandoned, stoned, cursed, snubbed, backstabbed, and treated like a doormat. And it's not all of those things all at one time, but enough of those things enough of the time that we begin to realize that not everybody loves us. And we wonder sometimes why people don't like us. And the reason that King Saul did not like David is because he was jealous of him. Again, to share Peterson's insights, Saul hated David because David was good. David was good. And eventually people were going to compare, and when they contrast, David's goodness would serve in exposing Saul's rottenness. And people had begun to compare. They had begun to stack the two up next to each other, even comparing the number of kills they had had in battle. And Saul was quite fearful of David. That happens when someone is jealous of you or envious of you, or someone wants what you have. And from the time that folks started comparing the two, it seems that David was the mightier warrior. In 1 Samuel 13:14, the prophet Samuel tells Saul that his kingdom will not endure, but the Lord had sought a man after his own heart. This was the aftermath of Saul's disobedience when he had made a sacrifice without waiting on Samuel, a legitimate priest, to come do it. But Saul had panicked in wartime and thought that he could bribe God to act. In chapter 15, Saul's arrogance is on display as he neglects or ignores God's command to wipe out everything to do with the Amalekites. But instead, Saul saves back some of the plunder, including sheep and cattle. He even allows the king of the Amalekites to live, and in his arrogance, Saul even erects a monument in his own honor. So Samuel says to Saul in verse 28, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you." As the comparisons between Saul and David begin, Saul must have expected that David would be a rival for his throne. David came into Saul's court after he had killed the giant Goliath with a slingshot. David continued to rack up the military victories. He was popular. He may have been hated by Saul, but he certainly wasn't hated by everyone, certainly not by a couple of Saul's children. His daughter Michal was in love with David, and his son Jonathan was David's best friend. In 1 Samuel 18, 1-4, we read this: "After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Jonathan became one in spirit with David. The King James Version more literally translates that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. Today, we would simply say that these two men were kindred spirits. They had some things in common. For one thing, they were both mighty warriors. Back in chapter 14, when Jonathan and his armor-bearer were separated from the other troops, they had clawed up the edge of a cliff with their hands and feet, and coming up over the cliff, they discovered a company of about 20 Philistine warriors. And they fought these warriors, and these two men took out 20 Philistines in the space of about half an acre. And so they fought against a common enemy. Now whether Jonathan and David were ever in battle together, we're not told, but it is likely. And there is hardly a greater bond than that between fellow warriors. I don't know of any unity like that between comrades in arms, guys who have been through basic training together, guys who've shared a foxhole together, or have fought shoulder by shoulder against a common enemy. Guys who are Army or Marine buddies. And that's the kind of camaraderie that was shared between Jonathan and David. They were buddies in a common cause. They had each other's backs. Jonathan was loyal to David, and that was a lifesaver for him. Someone in the royal court is looking out for him. Someone is defending him. To have had Jonathan as well as Saul for an enemy would have been very detrimental to David. Most of us would love to have this kind of friendship. Throughout the history of fiction, for example, there have been a lot of buddies. Buddies have always been popular because everybody wants a buddy like they see in the movies and the TV shows, from Robin Hood and Little John to the Lone Ranger and Tonto, Batman and Robin, Kirk and Spock, even Starsky and Hutch. And the picture that you're now looking at, this is an artistic piece by my daughter, who likes to take photos of action figures, and she doesn't use a sound stage. She actually goes out on location, and this was taken in a creek within walking distance of a certain church building. But these figures that you're looking at, Starsky and Hutch, those are from my childhood, actually. Those were my childhood action figures, and I've had them since I was like 11. And sorry I can't come up with anything but vintage stuff, but I just don't know about the new stuff. But I hear that buddy cop films are really in these days still. And one especially surprising buddy movie was the Thor and Hulk team up in Ragnarok. But one can only dream of friendships so close, at least most people. Jonathan and David were genuine friends, not just acquaintances. And as Peterson wrote, a friend is one who enters our lives looking for something other than someone to use. See, there are hundreds of people throughout our lives who are just looking for someone who can do them some good, someone who can come work as their employee and produce for them, or someone who can come in and be their customer or their client. But a friend isn't just out for what they can get. A friend wants to know you. They want to know what's going on with you. A friend does not exploit our weakness or attack our strength. It's great to have people around who just want to have us around. But intimate friendships are rare in this life. And by intimate, I don't necessarily mean romantic, but I mean close-knit relationships between kindred spirits. In Chuck Swindoll's book on the life of David in the Great Lives series, he estimates that for most of us, we have only one of these over the course of a lifetime. Occasionally two, but very rarely over three. How many really close friends do you have? And how many friends do you have that you have had since high school or even college, or even going all the way back to elementary school? It's really rare if you've kept a special friend that long, because people are so mobile these days and we tend to lose touch. Now, maybe we've made new friends wherever we've gone in every new situation. Perhaps ongoing friendships have something to do with proximity in most cases. And I often knock the downside of social media, but I'll tell you, there's something good about it too. And that is that we can keep up with people in all the places we've lived. We know who's having surgery. We know who's battling cancer. We know who's become a grandparent. We know who got married. And that's great for guys like me who hate writing letters, but have friends left behind in a lot of places. And I think some women are a bit better at nurturing these kinds of friendships than men are. Not always, but a lot of the time. They're sometimes more open to share, more open with their emotions, more willing to be vulnerable with a friend. But men need guy friends too. And I know that your spouse should be your best friend, but there are some things that I just wouldn't share with my wife. Not that I would not share them with her, but some things, only a guy can understand because he's a guy. Women need female friends, men need male friends. And I'm blessed to have made many friends over the course of my life in all the places where I've lived, and I feel that wherever I'm at in the country, there's someone I can call on. And David could always call on Jonathan. Jonathan, who in his loyal defense proves his loyalty, his friendship to David. In 1 Samuel 19:1, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. While Saul has tried to stealthily do away with David, he now comes out in the open with it and tells everyone, okay, I want you to kill him. Now, originally, he tried to be a little more stealthy about it. He sent David into battle, demanding that he kill 100 Philistines. David had no problem with that. He came back having killed 200 Philistines. But now Saul tries a more direct approach. But Jonathan was fond of David, so he warns him of his father's intent and promises to speak with Saul. Surely he cannot be serious. In chapter 19, verses 4 through 6, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all of Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. And Jonathan naively thought that this was the end of it, that his father was honestly confiding in him, and Saul usually did. But now mood swings had come along. No sooner does Saul decide he's going to lay off David than David has another military victory in verse 8. And then after that, Saul goes into a fit of a jealous rage, and in verses 9 and 10 he tries to pin David to the wall with his spear. Saul had tried that before in chapter 18, verses 10 and 11, but David escaped both times. Saul's behavior is at least partially attributed to an evil spirit from God, which kind of puzzles us. Walter Brueggemann's commentary on Samuel suggests that perhaps evil spirit was the only language that the ancients had for an emotional illness. Or perhaps it was a matter of God giving Saul over to his evil desires, just as he had done with Pharaoh years earlier. And when Saul opened himself up to this evil spirit, God did not providentially stop it. And in that sense, it was perhaps from God. But at any rate, we do know that over time, Saul had been losing it. He was at first drunk with his own arrogance. Instead of obeying God, he tried to use God for his own advantage, just as world leaders and politicians and monarchs have done since. And since learning that his kingdom would be lost, Saul had been subject to severe mood swings, emotional outbursts, fickle emotions, extreme fickleness. He was very unstable. And after unsuccessfully having tried to pin David to the wall with a spear, Saul sent a death squad to David's house. But he escaped with the help of his wife Michal, But even when she was questioned by Saul, she looked out for her own interests, claiming that David had threatened her, which of course was not true. Having received help from Saul's children, Jonathan and Michal, David then flees to his mentor Samuel, the prophet who had secretly anointed him as the next king. He takes David to a community of the prophets in Ramah, where perhaps David can hide out and not be found, but Saul is in hot pursuit. He sends 3 companies of soldiers to seek David out, one at a time, and each company of soldiers is overcome as God immobilizes them. The troops begin to prophesy as the Spirit of God comes on them. And when Saul himself arrives in verse 24, it says that he stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all day and all night, and this is why people say is Saul also among the prophets. In 1 Corinthians 14, it tells us that the spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets, allowing them to take turns and to speak in the assembly decently and in order. But in this case with Saul and his men, it seems that this overwhelming of the Spirit is involuntary. It apparently consists of what Brueggemann calls an ecstatic experience that causes messengers to break out of normal patterns of behavior and engage in frenzied or eccentric conduct. People asking whether Saul is among the prophets is reminiscent of an earlier story in chapter 10 where Saul had prophesied in their company. But on that occasion, the Spirit had served as Saul's ally, empowering him for the royal mission, the kingship. But now the Spirit plays a negative role, incapacitating Saul to hinder him in his pursuit of David. David's next stop will be at Jonathan's. David laments to him in 1 Samuel chapter 20, asking why Saul wants to kill him. What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to take my life? Jonathan's reply is denial. He simply won't hear of it. He simply won't believe it. You might ask, where has Jonathan been all this time? Saul tried to kill David or get him killed in battle. He threw a spear at him twice. He announced his intent to kill David. He sent a death squad to his house. He followed him, pursued him to Samuel's stomping grounds. Why is Jonathan in such disbelief? Well, maybe he doesn't know about all of that. Or maybe after his talk with Saul, who vowed not to harm David, Jonathan thought, well, that's the end of it. He didn't want to believe that his father would complicate his friendship with David, but David assures him in verse 3 that there is only a step between him and death. As a member of the court, David would be expected the next day at the New Moon Festival, where he was expected to dine with the king as a part of his court. And David decides, I'm not coming. And he'll say to Jonathan that Jonathan can go and tell David, or rather tell Saul, that David has been called back to Bethlehem to have a special sacrifice with his family. And Saul's reaction to that will be telling as to whether he really intends to harm David. If he throws a fit, if he goes into a jealous rage, then yes, his intent is to harm David. And Jonathan tells David to, the next evening after the feast, to hide in the tall grass behind a big rock, and toward evening on the day of the feast, Jonathan will go and shoot some arrows into the field in target practice, and depending upon the instructions he gives a boy with him to retrieve the arrows, this will say to David whether or not Saul tends to harm him. It's kind of like a secret signal between friends. Well, the following day, the king takes his place at the table by the wall. Kings always sat with their backs to the wall because there were too many people who literally wanted to backstab them. Saul at first assumes that David's absence must be due to some temporary ceremonial uncleanness, something of that nature, but he inquires of Jonathan and hears the concocted story that they came up with. And in verse 30, Saul's anger flares at Jonathan as he goes into another fit of rage. He curses Jonathan, calling him the son of a perverse and evil woman. We have a modern day equivalent for that, which I will not repeat here, but it reflects upon Jonathan's mother. Saul knows that the kingdom is at stake, and he warns Jonathan in verse 31 that if David continues to live, that Jonathan will not be the royal heir. It's interesting that Saul heard this from God's prophet himself, and yet he futilely works against God, trying to change a certain future. As Jonathan again comes to David's defense, Saul throws a spear at him, trying to pin him to the wall, just as he had done with David. The next evening, based on Jonathan's instructions to the young boy retrieving his arrows, Saul's intent to harm David is confirmed to him once more. The boy is sent home, and David comes out of hiding. The two friends share a sad farewell, knowing that things will never be the same again. About the middle of verse 41, going through verse 42, it says, "Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, 'Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Jonathan refers to this covenant between the two friends that they have made to always have each other's backs and to always treat each other's descendants with kindness, to protect each other's families, because Jonathan knows that David will have the throne someday, and Jonathan doesn't want David killing off all of his descendants, all of his family, which is why later on David shows kindness toward Mephibosheth. David had earlier appealed to this same covenant of friendship in verse 8, requesting kindness on Jonathan's part, and in verse 14, Jonathan had requested David's unfailing kindness like that of the Lord. Friends are those who are committed to each other's mutual well-being. Jonathan and David promise to be there for each other, whatever happens, come what may. And maybe you've known someone like that, and you and this person have decided to be there for each other no matter what happens. You've always known that they had your back. But as Peterson noted, in this covenant between Jonathan and David, it must be lived out within the context of hostility toward this covenant from another party. And so you might say that this is in some ways analogous to a marriage that did not have parental approval. But regardless of what other people think, or how other people try to deter them, friends will not separate. True friends stick together. Friends are those who listen. As Jonathan listened to David, he listened to him even when he did not really want to believe what he had to say. Friends are not afraid to be affectionate. They can even cry in each other's presence, as they do here. Sometimes you need a shoulder to cry on. And notice in verse 41 that David and Jonathan even kissed each other. Now, there is nothing wrong with an occasional bro hug or a fist bump once the pandemic is over. But I'll tell you one thing, I ain't kissing any guys. The only person in this world that I might even kiss would be my wife. Now, I used to kiss my kids, but they're grown and kind of too cool for that. But, maybe someday when grandchildren come along, maybe I'll kiss them. But right now, my wife is the only person I'll even think about kissing. But it was a different culture back then. And we should realize it without reading today's connotations back into another time. It was simply a show of affection, like shaking hands. And the point is that it's okay to love each other. It's okay to tell each other that you love each other. It's okay to say it. It's okay to have close relationships with people of the same gender. In fact, I think it's probably vital. To quote Peterson one more time, he says that practicing friendship is as much a spiritual discipline as scripture reading, prayer, or fasting. We need that in our lives. We need a Christian friend. But friendship can be costly. You invest time, you listen, you help whenever it's within your power, you forbear with another's faults, they forbear with yours. From a totally earthly and limited perspective, it would seem that Jonathan's friendship with David could be very costly to Jonathan. Very costly to be David's friend, because Jonathan knows he won't inherit the throne because his father won't have a dynasty. But instead of being jealous, Jonathan values David's friendship. As Brueggemann said, the transfer of Jonathan's robe and armor to David in chapter 18 could be symbolic of the transfer of the right to the throne. Even Jesus surrounded himself with people he called friends. But on the cross, only one friend, his closest friend, stood nearby, the disciple Jesus loved. Whereas Jonathan had been there for David, John was now there for the Son of David. In each case, the friends of the Lord's anointed knew that their loyalty could cost them their lives. What might it cost any one of us to be a friend of Jesus? It could cost you some of your own friends who aren't as loyal. Some will disown you, believing that you've become one of those nutcase Bible thumpers. You could lose a job by refusing to toe the Orthodox party line. Family members may abandon you, or at least the relationship will be strained, because once you convert, you take on a whole new set of values that puts you in the minority. People despise Jesus or his teachings for the same reasons that Saul despised David. They see Jesus as a threat. He's a threat to our kingdom, to our throne, to the way that we might choose to live. But if we listen, he offers a much better way. So count the cost and see if you think it's worth it to be a friend to Jesus. And we urge you to take that step today.